McCaughern. He's agreed to come and spend a week with us, and we're working pretty hard for the week. He hasn't had much time to rest already. He arrived on Saturday. We had him out on farm yesterday, and he's doing the 2 zone meetings today. Well, the 6 zone meetings across the province. So we brought him here as part of the extension component of the beef initiative. And what we're interested in doing is mining his knowledge and experience in terms of optimizing forage in cattle diets, but in particular in feeding diets for beef cattle. And certainly I've learned a lot in the last couple of days being able to spend time with him. And we certainly appreciate the opportunity to have him here in Nova Scotia. I'm not sure we picked the best time of the year to bring him here, but it is what it is, and you know, it's a great opportunity for you as producers to get some exposure to his knowledge. But our real interest in Perennia is to kind of try and build on and figure out from what the work that he's doing, how we can improve the efficiency of feeding cattle in Nova Scotia. James, I'll let you fill in the blanks that I missed in terms of who you are.
Thanks for the introduction, Jonathan. Oh, I'll just disappoint after that.
I don't know what that is.
Good evening, everybody. I should also, is it okay with me wandering around slightly?
It should follow you.
Yeah, I only asked because at one point I went to one of these things once and I wandered out and out.
No, it should follow you.
It should follow me off. Because I have a habit of talking nonsense. So I've been asked to give you a presentation on optimizing forage within finishing our feeder beef cattle diets. Now, I mean, a lot of what I'm going to say this evening, sorry, it's not today, this evening, or tonight if I'm working in my time, is really related to, I start off by sort of working on our systems, our forage types, our climatic conditions, and gradually working more towards Canadian/Nova Scotian type stuff. And there are some differences in there, but in terms of or from what I can see, the principles of diet formulation and effectively producing cattle are to a large extent the same. Now, in terms of my history, I'm a beef and sheep farmer. Harper Adams University is located in England. My accent is not English. I was, well, or still am Irish. Advantage of being Northern Irish, you get 2 passports, you get 2 nationalities, you can either be European or non-European, as the case may be. I am a sheep farmer. This is my sister. That is our farm. That is really what it looks like. I did move to England and join Harper Adams University as a researcher. I'd love to say that that was some great calling for research or something like that, but quite frankly, one of the main reasons was you were able to get time off during the day, and they would let me run over their mountains in the mainland UK, whereas you can't do that in Ireland, so that'd be a big draw. This here picture, just out of interest, the highest mountain in Wales, Snowdon, that's essentially, we call that Crib Goch in Welsh. That's you can run up that to the top, around the top, back down again. In terms of research, quite varied. I mean, I would have started in terms of minerals and dairy cattle. I would have completed through industry a large number of topics related to forages and finishing beef cattle or feeder cattle on forages. I work a lot nowadays in disease diagnostics, so trying to develop new diseases for various new tests for various diseases. So that could be acidosis in grain-fed cattle, or into things like, say, a mineral toxicity, so like copper toxicity or deficiency. I will talk a little bit, and this has become a large thing in Western Europe. Whereas you're talking about climate change adaptation, we would be at this moment in time hugely pressured into what are we contributing in terms of greenhouse gases. As a scientist, I'm actually quite cynical as to agriculture's contribution of greenhouse gases, but unfortunately legislators don't see it that way. And that actually, going forward, is going to have a big impact, unfortunately, on what we do, and I don't see that changing regardless of what decisions are making going forward. Just as a little bit of background, I know this is mostly on cattle, but where I'm from in the very, very north coast of Ireland, temperatures generally sit sort of north of 0 degrees. We are but never much higher than 20 degrees. What does that mean? It means that we would struggle to grow corn silage. And if we do, we generally have to grow it under plastic. Because conditions are so wet, we also struggle to grow a whole variety of grain crops as well. For that reason, straw bedding is incredibly expensive, so you tend not to, or you don't actually find straw bedded systems. We just don't have them. And we tend to have relatively high levels of rainfall. So as a rough guide, we'll have about 1.5 to 2 meters of rainfall a year. It would be higher than most of Nova Scotia, actually, given some of the numbers I've looked at. So what that means is that feed prices or grain prices are really quite high a lot of the time. And actually, if you look at our sheep sort of in this here photograph up above, you can see that they actually spend a lot of their time waddling through mud, certainly whenever it comes to the winter. And what does that mean for sheep farming? Well, our sheep farming system is basically outside all year round. It costs us quite simply too much to house. Either in straw bedding terms and in actual feed terms. So we will graze the entire production cycle. We will rotationally graze our own land in the summertime. And in the winter time, we have quite a large dairy industry that houses cattle most of the time, quite simply because our soils are not able to keep them upright. They poach. And as a result, there are lots of dairy farmers with residual grass through the winter, and that's essentially where we live nomadically almost during the winter. Now, the general dairy farmer would bill us 75p per ewe per head per week in the winter time. That is actually less than the cost of growing that grass. Okay, so we're essentially dealing with a dairy farmer's byproduct whenever we graze during the winter. So those are kind of the climatic conditions on which we're actually producing forage. And you can see how really all we've really got is forage quality control under our circumstances. Okay, we do have a little bit of snow. Snow's actually not much of a problem. You can see we lamb outside in snow. We don't intervene at lambing. We run a breed developed in Wales called Easy Care, designed to lamb easily. They shed their wool and they're really a no intervention breed, and we treat them as such. So you can see we lamb in snow. What's really of concern for us actually is driving wind and rain. So you can see this lovely individual has actually found some shelter to actually have her lambs in this scenario. Okay. Now, if you go across to Harper Adams University in this photograph, as a rough idea, we do a lot, mostly of teaching. We were an agricultural college once upon a time before we became a university, and we produce slightly over half the number of students that enter the UK agricultural system. We probably have the largest agricultural cohort there or thereabouts, kind of in Western Europe. We would be up there with some of the other big universities and some of the other Western European countries. In terms of now geographically, to get to Harper Adams, you go into Scotland about 7 hours south. Very different climatic conditions, about 600 millimeters of rainfall. Very sandy soils. We can grow pretty much anything you could imagine. Corn silage, perennial ryegrass, carrots, fresh produce, lettuce. We have strawberry growers. Anything and everything comes through Shropshire. So quite contrasting in terms of actual climate. Not that actual far apart as the crow flies. We have a dairy herd. We have sheep. but what's probably of more interest for this is that we have indoor and outdoor beef production systems. We have dairy beef production systems. We generate our dairy calves from our dairy herd. We utilize sex semen, which means that we only need about 25 to 30% of our Holstein cows to produce replacements. That leaves about 75% of our cows that can go to beef semen. In terms of beef sires, we would use British Blue or Belgian Blue, would have been the forerunner, but British Blue would be the new breed version of that. We will use Aberdeen Angus, and we will also use to some extent British Beef Shorthorn, which is kind of like an Angus in terms of its native breeding and characteristics. So what I'm going to show you today, folks, is mostly centered around this indoor beef system. Now, traditionally in the UK, if you took the UK in general, we would house animals during the winter and graze them during the summer. Because of our soil and climatic conditions at Harper, we will actually do both for the simple reason that it allows us to maximize our indoor feed space if we keep animals inside in a very rapid production system all of the time. And then we will also be able to seasonally use an outdoor system. So our outdoor beef herd, I'm not going to say much about it today, but they go outside roughly about 500 pounds in live weight, and they will stay out there for their entire lifetime. We will put them through a rotational grazing system in the summer. We will put them through forage crops, whether that be keel into fodder beet. We may even use bale grazing. We haven't done, but that would be an option that we can do with high quality forage if we wanted to. And that's generally our outdoor system. Now, in terms of our indoor system and the diets and the use of forage within those diets and things that we do, you can see that even though where I'm from in Ireland, straw in a bad year can be as expensive as grain, if not higher. You don't have to go that far away, and it's actually a waste product. You can use it for bedding. So our animals are kept on at Harper on straw bedded systems. For the indoor system, we use high performance British Blues, generally because we want as fast a growth rate as possible and as high a yield of meat as possible. They will enter the system at roughly about 220 pounds. Okay, we'll start feeding them a forage-based diet at that stage currently, and we take them all the way up to somewhere around 433 pounds. Now, we can take them a lot higher than that, okay, on those diets. The simple reason that we don't do that is our carcass specs allow them to finish smaller, which for us, a smaller animal growing quickly is actually more efficient overall. So we will actually offload them and replace the pen with smaller animals to keep that level of efficiency going. Our heifers and steers currently finish at about 13.3 months of age and 15 months of age respectively. So we're talking a relatively short, sharp production cycle inside. Now, in terms of what we've got going on here, we've just got some pictures. So here we're rotational grazing our Angus on perennial ryegrass and a little bit of clover coming in there. You can see that we can take them on the sandy soils to very high live weights, up to 1,400 pounds relatively easily, high fat score. You're probably talking live weight gains easily of 1.5 pounds a day plus, maybe all the way up to 2 on those outdoor rotational grazing systems. And you can see we can also grow corn silage relatively easily, quickly, with a relatively high total digestible nutrient value. So we've got all this selection of crops that we can play with or that we can use in our beef production systems. It really is the land of plenty. Where I'm from in Ireland, you've pretty much got your grass. That's all you've got. That's all you can use, which is actually quite restrictive in a way. Now, we have got a complicated scenario when it comes to what we've got going on with both our political climate, the social aspect of our beef production, our environment. If you were to ask me about what is a sustainable system, I would ultimately jump to, you know, profitability, pounds, shillings, and pence, dollars. I think I've done that. Yeah. But if you look at Europe and where agricultural policy is going, I know that the UK have left Europe, haven't left Europe, have left Europe, haven't left, whatever they've done. They've done something. You will find all of these other issues coming to the fore as well. And it's just something to kind of address. We have water quality issues with nitrogen and phosphorus pollution within Ireland. You have the most polluted lake in Europe. We have biodiversity loss, we have soil health. These lower three I'd actually class as quite considerable problems for UK agriculture. Unfortunately, the politicians would say that climate change and reducing emissions from agriculture is a major concern, which actually worries me because I do a lot of work in terms of net zero and carbon footprinting and talking about methane and all that there sort of stuff. And I would say that, you know, agriculture really doesn't contribute to it. I'd say that oil and gas have done a very good job of actually blaming us in certain countries and policies that we're bringing in for it. Okay, so these are all considerations that are going on in the background, as well as just feeding animals and economics that we've got coming in there. Now, feed in itself, forage, grain, whatever you want to feed to your animal, in our systems, in the indoor system, it's roughly about 75% of all of our costs. For the outdoor system, it nearly is the sum total of our costs. Okay, so the variety of things and tools that we have in the toolbox to change it, to alter it, contribute considerably to our profitability. Now, in terms of the topic areas that I would think about when it comes to diet formulation, in where Harper is based, we have a history of just buying grain and feeding it. For the simple reason that it was easy to grow barley, easy to harvest it, and relatively easy to feed it to high production beef cattle and get very high growth rates. But some circumstances may have changed that. So of interest would be, you know, can we use forages instead under different circumstances? What are the effects of that forage? Is there anything we can do there? Is it important? Is it yield? What effect has yield got on quality? Those there sorts of things. And, you know, we've got other things like low protein diets. So protein generally costs us a lot of money. It's probably it is the most expensive component of any diet. So is there any way of actually lowering that? Okay. Now, the scenarios that I'm about to work at, folks, are I'm just going to schedule them for a 500 kilogram or 1,100 pound continental cross British blue steer in these scenarios. Okay, and I've set our growth rate at roughly the growth rate that we expect through our beef system. We would hold about 1.5 kilograms a day, 3.2 pounds a day is generally what we're after. Okay, the whole way through the cycle. Now, I've said net zero, which doesn't mean very much to a lot of people. The basic concept of net zero is you're emitting gases. Methane is generally considered to be the most worrisome one. It is probably of concern that most consumers seem to think it comes out the rear end of the animal and not actually out the front, which is where most of it comes from. But from our system, if we take a typical beef system, the idea is you're emitting these gases, they cover the planet, you increase global temperatures would be the general concept. And generally the emissions is coming from feed production, fertilizers that we sow would be a big one. We then get methane coming from our animals during rumen fermentation. We also then get some emissions from stored manures, slurries, liquids, anything that comes out the back end. Okay, so when a UK farmer has to carbon footprint their system, those are all of the things that actually
adds up. Okay, now I'm not saying that this is actually meaningful. I'm not saying that cows contribute to global warming. That's a totally different conversation. I'm saying in terms of the mathematics of how this is considered, that's the sort of thing we're looking at. You also then get some removal. So as you grow trees, as you grow hedges, you get sequestration. Now, one of the simple facts of life, and this has got me into trouble with UK media in the past, is that the fewer the number of days an animal is alive, the less you have to pay to keep it alive. So when it comes to any form of pollution, quite frankly, if you have a lower age at slaughter, that animal has been less polluting. And in terms of your economics, provided you've kept your diet cost relatively low, if you lower days at slaughter, by definition, you lower the number of days you have to pay to keep that animal alive. So you can increase your growth rate, or you would be the main one, whilst keeping your feed cost at roughly the same quantity. Okay, it's a little bit of a sidestep, but it's just something that we have to bear in mind in the background. Now, what I've thrown up here is a typical UK barley-based diet. It can be as straightforward as just putting barley in. Instead of soya, we would use European rapeseed as our source of protein. So you basically mix your barley with your rapeseed, add in some minerals, and you're good to rock and roll. Historically, that is the diet that you would feed in various parts of the grain belt within England and higher up in Scotland. What I've got here, folks, is a slightly more complex version. You can see we've got 72% rolled barley, approximately, rapeseed meal about 5%, and then you've just got various, molasses, cane molasses we would have in there as a palatability enhancer to try and force them to eat more. Wheat distillers is just another version of rapeseed meal. So that's the basic principle. Okay, that would be the typical diet that would be fed. In fact, in England, a lot of farmers would grow it and they would feed it. Okay, works really well in terms of you can grow barley, certainly agronomically all of the time with very little issues. And then you can easily harvest that and stick it through an animal in a straw bedded system. You use the straw for bedding. Now, the issue with that is that eventually, at one point in time, Putin invaded the Ukraine, and our feed and grain prices went absolutely through the roof. To such an extent that at the height, if you actually cost what we would pay for this diet, it went all the way up nearly as far as $600 a ton. Okay, at the very height, those were the sort of prices that we were actually quoted, $600 a ton. Notice how we're expecting the animal to grow at 3.2 pounds a day. That's consistent the whole way through this. Now, what I've done is I've taken that and I've worked out, so how much feed are we expected to put in at the front end of the animal? How much are they going to eat? Well, they're going to eat 20 pounds a day effectively. Worked out, this is our beef price. So our beef price is generally sitting around $3.60, slightly lower than yours would be at the minute. And I've worked out how much money a farmer would effectively be if you count how much feed goes in versus how much beef comes out. And you can see that if we did actually purchase that feed, if we did actually feed it, our profitability for every pound of gain would only have been 9 cents. Okay, so absolutely nothing if you add any other costs in there at all. Okay, so that's the sort of scenario that we've got. Now, the alternative to that is we work on a high quality forage. Now, at Harbour, we've quite advantageous. We've got a variety of them we can choose from. So this next example to compare it to on the green side of the slide is a diet, comparable diet, so comparable level of performance. You can see we're still expecting 3.6 pounds per day, but this time we're basing it on high quality corn silage. And this is actually nearly the diet that we actually feed. So you can see we've got 50% of corn silage coming in there. We then put in some high quality grass silage. Our grass silage would be high sugar perennial ryegrasses, which tend to carry a lot of leaf material that's very digestible. So you can see we've got very high TDNs from grass silage. So we can see we get up as high as 79% TDN. With very high crude proteins, about 17%. So basically, we have our corn silage, which is our energy. We have our grass silage, which gives us that protein. And we quite simply add those in to make a mostly forage-based diet of about 67–68%. Now, we do feed rolled barley quite simply, or a little tiny bit of rolled barley, because quite simply, what you find is that whenever you're feeding an animal for very high live weight gains, the first little bit of concentrate gets you, or grain, sorry, gives you a maximum return for the money that you put in there, even though it is expensive. Okay, so even though it is expensive. Now, as a comparison between the two, this diet's costing nearly $600 a ton. This one on the right, $240 a ton. And the first thing you notice is that your margin over feed, so your profitability for every pound of average daily gain jumps from 9 cents all the way up to $1.10. Okay, so we get a massive improvement between those two. Okay, massive improvement between those two. Now, actually, we can also do this in the inverse and work out how low. Now, our feed prices now in the UK have continued to drop. From this point in time, this was the highest point. They've continually come back and dropped and dropped and dropped. Now, for this diet on the left to be comparable to this one on the right, they would have to half to $240 a ton. Our feed prices have never returned to the levels that they were before Putin invaded the Ukraine. And in fact, for that reason, we still feed this forage-based diet on the right-hand side, but with the same level of performance. And the important thing about that is that performance comes from the quality of the forages that are in there. In Ireland, where I'm from, we cannot grow the corn silage, so we would probably be betting everything on producing that level of grass silage, and we would pretty much feed it straight with a tiny little bit of barley coming in there. Okay, so my uncle, who is a beef finisher in Ireland, that will be the way that he works. Okay, so you can see as we swap from a grain-fed diet to a high-quality forage diet, same level of performance is possible or is achievable. There's a variety of ways of getting there. The next thing that, if we try and look in our case at different qualities of grass silage, so on the left, we've got our high quality one for us, which would be a 79% TDN, slightly different with some of the grasses that you guys grow here and various other things. Perennial ryegrass hasn't got much cold hardiness, whereas for us it works okay. But you can see with a low quality perennial ryegrass, we ultimately drop down to 71% TDN. What does that mean? It means that if we end up with a lower quality silage, we end up having to put more barley and rapeseed meal in, which would be our protein blend, and you can see our $1.10 drops down to $1.07. Now, it doesn't make much of a difference, but if we had a grass silage only diet, it makes a massive difference coming through there. Now, I'll come back to some other different grass types slightly later on. Okay, so you can see grain-fed diet to a total mixed ration coming in here of forage. You can see the effect we have of our relative forage quality. Corn silage for us would be an incredibly consistent forage. We'll pretty much always end up year on year with what we have up there, certainly whenever it comes to Harper. Now, the next thing that we can do is we could potentially use grain depending on the price. We could potentially use a variety of forages to come in there depending on our interaction of our various different costs. The next thing, and this is something that is not common in the UK, is we can actually formulate low protein diets. Certainly if we're on various grains like barley, we can formulate a low protein diet. or if we're on the corn silage, which is typically only 8.5% crude protein, for us, maybe down as low as 7, we can formulate, instead of putting soybean meal or rapeseed meal in, we can actually formulate low protein diets. Now, crude protein, which we've got here, CP, crude protein is a very crude measurement of the protein content of a diet. Basically, it's the nitrogen content multiplied by 6.25, and that could be nitrogen in anything. Might not even be in protein, it's just nitrogen that happens to be around or is hung around to be analysed. This one just below, we would call it metabolizable protein, is actually an estimate of the amount of true protein that is produced in that animal's rumen and also bypasses into the digestive tract. So our metabolizable protein supply is actually an indicator of what that animal is actually producing. You can see on this diet here, it's 75 grams, whereas on this diet over here is 62 grams. Now, what that allows us to do is it allows us to match the protein supplied in the rumen to the animal's requirements. So instead of just picking a random crude number, which could be 12.7%, that might be used efficiently, it might not. It's basically just a guessing game. But your MP will actually allow you to focus in on how much the animal requires and how much you've actually producing. And you can see that can have quite a profound effect. So on this diet on the left, you can see we're at $239 a ton. Whenever we formulate to crude protein of about 12.5%, which is about where we would normally be, you can see that comes all the way down to 176 whenever we actually say, well, we actually need an MP supply of 62 grams in this case, which leaves us with about 10% crude protein. That's actually a little high. Our system in itself would say that probably 9.8 is enough. I tend to put a little bit extra in just to be sure. And you can see our effective margin over feed. So our margin over feed jumps up from $1.10 up to $1.27. Now, what does that mean? It means that this diet that we have on the right tends to be the one that we feed. We tend to go for a corn silage base. We tend to add in our protein with a grass silage. I tend to like to have enough grass silage to take all of our soya out, just have a little bit of rolled barley, and that's what we work on. Now, what are the concepts there? We've got a very high level of performance for us in the UK on steers and heifers. We could switch to bulls, which would be a higher level of performance again. But economically, that's probably the best that we can do in the intensive system. I don't know if we could take it much further than that with much else. But because we finish in a very short period of time, we also have a very low quantity of emissions. Now, if you put it in some sort of perspective, the carbon emissions of the average farm in the UK is about 26 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of beef produced. We're all the way down around 12. Okay. Now, if you take regionally, this is our regional number, you can see we're below pretty much everyone else. And it's quite simply, it's the fact of driving very high growth rates from whatever feed source that we are feeding. Okay. Now, in reality, we don't always feed an 1,100 pound feeder animal, finishing animal. In reality, we're actually feeding, if you think about it, we're producing dairy beef, so we will feed anywhere from about 209 pounds all the way up to 1,300 pounds, although you could go way higher than that. You could go all the way up to 1,600 pounds on that finishing diet. As I've said before, the reason we stop so early is kind of because we can. Now, what does that mean? Well, here we're actually tying protein requirements to the animal size. So you can see the only difference between these diets is that our protein blend or quantity of rapeseed meal, soya, continually goes up. Now, we don't make 3 physical diets. What we actually do is we make the finishing one first. We feed all of our finishing cattle. We'll just tip in some protein blend, feed the growing ones, and then they'll tip in slightly more protein blend, and then feed our growing phase one. So those first sort of 200 to 450 pound animals. Separating a calf from a cow, as happens in the dairy beef system, what happens in a cow-calf pair or a suckler cow, as we would call them, is that up to about 450, 600 pounds, that animal is effectively synthesizing high-quality protein in the milk to grow that calf. It's one of the biological wonders of the world, to me, that one, actually. Whereas whenever we remove that animal and put it through a dairy beef system from a dairy cow, actually the most vulnerable stage are these early phases, which is why in our outdoor beef system, we don't actually turn them out until they're relatively robust, up around 500 pounds, 600 pounds. But you can see we have to feed lots of protein to counter for that. Now, if you look at our average daily gain or growth rates along the bottom, you can see that we don't grow at the same rate the whole way through. It does tend to change around a little bit. As those calves are developing their rumen and starting to accelerate, you can see it's down around 2.5 pounds a day, but will accelerate all the way up to 3.33. Our steers will pretty much hold that until slaughter. Hence why we slaughter them when we do, because that will start to dip down afterwards. You can see our heifers just don't hold it just quite as long, okay? Now, in terms of margin over feed, to give you a comparison of some of the diets that I've formulated there, you can see predicted to be somewhere around $1.50, I think, a pound, somewhere around that, or was it $1.26? Sorry, you can see that actually, whenever we put it through the animals with our modern genetics, we're actually quite a little bit more efficient than that. We probably underestimate the efficiency of the genetic gains that we've made in the times that since these feeding systems have been created. So you can see steers and heifers were around about $1.47, accelerating up to $1.48, $1.46, and then dropping whenever we get that lesser efficient adult animal towards the end. Now that's really our scenarios that we've got going there and the principles that surround them. Now, I mean, one of the big things that we would have is that the way that we improve forage quality, or the biggest determinant of forage quality for us, is quite simply to harvest grasses, certainly. Not as important with clovers and things, they will hold quality for longer, but we quite simply cut them earlier, okay? Now, the problem with cutting them earlier is that certainly with perennial ryegrasses, although I don't think it's as to such an extent with some of the grasses that you're working with, when we cut earlier, we get a lower yield, certainly of dry matter and definitely of fresh weight that you will observe. So here, if we look at a 3 harvest system for us versus a 4 harvest system, you can see that our yield will drop from 13.4 tons of dry matter on the 3 harvest system all the way down to 12.4 tons of dry matter. But our TDM will increase from about 71% dry matter up to 74. So you can see that we get a greater quantity of digestible nutrients on that one, on our 4 cut system, versus our 3 harvest system. So in other words, we've got a greater concentration of energy, greater concentration of protein. Now in Ireland, bear in mind that we don't have maize, which is incredible, sorry, maize. A professor did a lecture the other week on why it should be called maize and not corn. Find that one quite funny. Corn silage comes to me easier because I published in the Journal of Dairy Science. Corn silage is relatively linear in terms of quality. Okay. In Ireland, certainly in the north of Ireland, we haven't got corn silage. So we are heavily focused on yields of energy and yields of protein from grasses. Now, if you went to Northern Ireland today, you probably wouldn't see a farmer, as I would have done in the early 2000s, talking about yield of silage. Nowadays, they probably moved on to the physical yield of beef or the yield of milk that will come from a unit area. So in other words, the interest is not in how many bales I got, how many trailer loads I got, how much dry matter came off that hectare. The interest is in, once you've taken that and turned it into a diet, and once you've got the performance out of the animal, what's the yield of that at the end, which is actually an interaction of all the factors in the middle. And I've kind of tried to do that here, sorry, or I have done that here. Okay, so if we look at I've made a mistake. The 4 harvest system should be in the 17th of May. We tend to cut, our growing season starts earlier than you guys, so just ignore the dates. That's just to give you some idea when that happens. Our 4 harvest system would start on the 17th of May. Our 3 harvest system would start on the 29th of May, and we'll cut either every 35 days or every 50 days. Okay. Now, we get, as we've already said, we get that higher yield of dry matter on our 4 harvest system versus our 3 harvest system. But let's say, for example, we took that forage and we fed it directly to a 770 pound steer. Okay. Because of the greater nutrient density in our 4 harvest system, you can see we get about 2.7, 2.8 pounds per day of growth. Whereas in our 3 harvest system, we only get 2.2. What does that mean? It means that although you have more forage in the 3 harvest system, they grow slower. So actually you have a greater number of days where the forage is just feeding, keeping that animal alive, and not actually growing it. Okay, so you've got a trade-off. You've got physical yield versus yield of useful energy are the 2 trade-offs here. Now, you will hit a situation whereby that yield on one side becomes more important than the improvement in energy on the other. But you can see in this scenario with these cuts of forage that we're expected to get 1.85 tons of beef from the 3 harvest system and 2.14 tons of carcass beef from the 4 harvest system. Okay, sorry, live weight, not carcass, live weight. So 1.85 tons versus 2.14 tons. So even though you've got a higher physical yield of forage on the 3 harvest system, it's forecasting less beef. If you were to talk to a Northern Irish farmer nowadays, they would probably be talking to you in terms of growth rate potential and milk yield potential. Certainly programs like Grass Check that measure it and present it in this format is what they're familiar with. And in terms of profitability, keeping that theme going, we've got margin over feed at the minute. I've used something similar to your current beef price just to roughly estimate this and give you a feel for what it would be. Your margin over feed in dollars per pound for the 3 harvest systems, say you did end up with a forage like this, would be $2.93 versus $4.14. My interpretation of the types of grass and forages that you would have available tend to have a greater proportion of stem relative to leaf than we would have with perennial ryegrass. So that basically means that from a starting point, your percentage TDN tends to be lower than we would have with perennial ryegrass. But what I would say is some of the forages that guys have been showing me over the last few days have got as high as 71% and 74%. There are some forages out there that are that high. Okay. But if you take your typical forages, and I've got this from Brenia, you can see that generally it's the effect of cutting date that's coming in there. So what stage of growth are you cutting? So you can see with cutting at the vegetative stage, you're up at 63 versus mature stage, you're all the way down at 44% dry matter. Now, the thing I would say is that perennial ryegrasses with us tend to change quality over a very long period of time. Whereas a lot of the grasses that you might grow, things like orchard grass, timothy, actually change quality quite quickly. Now, to me, the way that works is actually, you can actually change quality quite quickly, but not lose much yield by not moving that far forwards, is the way the biology would work out in my head, potentially. But there are no numbers here that would suggest that concretely say that. Now, just to give you some idea, if I then took those TDN values and knocked them into a beef diet to give you 2.21 pounds a day, so again, target growth rate here of 2.21 pounds a day. You've got your vegetative, you've got your buds, you've got your bloom. I've just said here, I mean, you can see the prices that I've roughly estimated along the sides. Your cost of forage there, $92 a ton, would be what I've currently got in terms of approximate cost of production. Barley $330 and soybean meal $900. And you can see as you progressively move from the left of the screen to the right of the screen, you need more barley, and then you need more protein source coming in there to counter that decline in forage quality. And what does that mean? It means if we bring up our old friend, margin over feed in dollars per pound, it gradually goes down from $2.67 a pound all the way down to $1.88. I suppose that would be the end of the presentation. If there's any questions or thoughts or names to call me. If there's anyone left.
Any questions? It's very quiet tonight.
You mentioned trace minerals and that, is that an issue in the UK as well? Like here, it seems to be a bit of an issue not getting enough, but you say sometimes it's an issue getting too much over there.
Copper, as a primary example, would be our most common mineral deficiency. It would also be our most common mineral toxicity. If you think about that, strange one, isn't it? It's the most common mineral deficiency. It's the most common mineral toxicity. And when I say most common mineral toxicity, evidence at abattoirs would suggest that about 40% of our dairy cull cows contain toxic liver copper concentrations.
Wow.
And there is evidence coming out of the US, if you do the calculations, if you have either a child whose liver is not as robust as an adult would be, or you have a genetic defect within your liver, or any sort of issues with alcoholism or whatever it may be, taxation upon the liver, that your liver is weakened, as little as a little packet of liver would be enough to potentially kill you in terms of copper toxicity. Now, in UK abattoirs, that's not monitored, so they wouldn't know, which is why I don't eat liver in the UK. So we have this issue where we have animals dropping dead of copper deficiency. We also then have quite a high level of copper toxicity. Copper deficiency really bad as well. Basically, copper is required for every biological mechanism. If you run out of it, functions just shut down and you eventually die. So we have that sort of dual scenario. And what's quite simply going on is that farmers either tend to, it's not farmers in I would say it's our feed industry, either tends to give copper or they don't. So if you've got a sheep farmer in Wales and their land is naturally copper deficient, they should probably be giving some of it. They don't ever. and therefore the animal just eventually drops dead of copper toxicity.
I thought cotton was bad for sheep.
It is, hence the copper toxicity. At the same time, that farmer is a farmer next door, whose sheep are living on top of a copper mine. And they already have a relatively high copper status. But his nutritionist has told them that they need copper. So he gives them copper every 6 months, and they suddenly start dying of copper toxicity. So you can see whereby, and what's going on there is that sheep in particular have a very narrow operating range within which they can operate. And basically, when I speak to a farmer, I basically say to him, A, where's he from? She from? And if they're from a region that naturally has soils that won't provide copper deficiency, you don't need to supplement for sheep. There'll be a breed effect in there as well. Or if they are from an area where copper deficiency is a serious problem, they need to supplement, start looking into it, keep track of it. So sheep are relatively straightforward. The problem with the beef and dairy sectors is that there has been a tendency to just put copper in everything. So say I fed a diet where I buy, maybe I feed in my milking parlour and I feed out of parlour. You're one feed company and I buy the milking parlour feed from you. So you put it in. You're a different feed company and I buy the out of parlour feed from you. So you put it in. Meanwhile, someone else has wandered in and sold me something else with copper in it that I don't know is in there. And you can see how very quickly you end up with. We've surveyed dairy farms around Harper, and how many of it? Cows, a dairy cow requires roughly about 10 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter. There was one of the 50 was close to it. The mean of the dairy farms was 30, and some of them were feeding above the maximum legal level at that time of 40. I believe there's one even up at 80 or 90 milligrams. So you're talking about providing 9 times what that animal needs. On that survey, we said to them, you know, because there was a whole ethical thing of should we tell them what their levels were. And we basically said whenever we collected the samples, if you want to know, come back and ask us. Can you guess how many of our 50 farmers? None. No. But in defense of our agricultural industry, to me, that is the feed industry's problem. It is not an on-the-ground farmer problem. That should be our feed industry is taking account of that. Because their response is, well, you know, the guideline is 20, so we'll just all put 20 in. But as I say, if you add together 2 or 3 components, you end up at 60, just like that. So hence you can see why it's our most common deficiency and most common toxicity. To such an extent, my worry is if we shone too big a light on it, the dairy industry in the UK would get quite heavily. So that thing I've just told you, I tend not to tell. I certainly wouldn't say that in front of the British media.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah.
But the industry does know and refuses to, they just refuse to. My worry with it is where we end up is that basically your minerals will be decided by your vet. So basically you'll need a veterinary practice to decide what feeds you will have your minerals at. Is my worry of where we end up.
Because in this province, we're deficient in selenium's a big one.
Selenium's quite good. Things like selenium, you can't cause toxicity, really, unless you were grazing certain parts of China. It's quite difficult to cause selenium toxicity. So you can pretty much just, you know, my general advice to people on minerals is copper if you're farming sheep, that's the one to worry about. If you're farming cattle, you can easily put some in and it makes no difference. You know, as long as you're not putting in those magnificent quantities. Your other trace minerals, selenium, its effects on fertility. If your soil's deficient, put it in anyway. It costs virtually nothing and you get very high rewards from it. Your other ones, iodine, zinc, again, massively high toxicity levels. You're not going to do any harm, so you may as well put it in. In terms of sources, our research would suggest that, what sort of sources do you use? Is it like an injection or a drench down the throat or?
I would say primarily just like a mineral,
Like tub or a loose mineral.
a loose mineral is probably the most common.
Probably the most effective one for grazing animals outside is we get boluses, common use in New Zealand. They last 6 months, and that way you're 100% certain that that animal's got what it has. The problem with mineral lick buckets is they tend not to lick them enough.
I'm not sure we have any bonuses that would be licensed in Canada.
Really? Yeah, I mean, you're into, some is better than nothing. I mean, in the past, I've even mixed it into little bits of barley and just given it to them in a trough in the field, just to dose a mineral and that works fine.
I don't know, do many guys inject minerals or
Other than selenium, no.
no?
But yeah, selenium, you're not going to cause toxicity, so yeah, I would be putting
And
that.
there's regions of the province where we do see copper deficiencies in cattle. It's not across the province, but there are areas, and Dan sees it in dairy cattle more frequently than we see it in beef cattle.
Well, yeah, if you're producing high milk yields, the chances are you would.
Like I honestly can't tell you that I've seen a copper deficient beef cow, but he certainly sees copper deficiencies in dairy cows on, depending on the region of the province, fairly frequently.
So yeah, that would be my general, as a sort of like an easy, straightforward way of doing it. But yeah, I mean, we get swings in, you know, so we would scientifically make copper toxic dairy cattle, and we get swings in fertility at 25% for a disease that you can't see. You just go, well, my AIM's not good this month, but your conception to first and second service could drop from 96% down to 70%, just like that. And you also see, I mean, we'll vaccinate them to simulate a health challenge. And you'll also see massive modulatory effects on the immune system. So for example, they may hypothetically struggle with tuberculosis, which in the UK is a massive problem. So you've got two issues. You've got tuberculosis raging through the sector, and then we've also got potentially copper toxicity that's meaning your immune system can't really cope with it. The other thing that comes in there. Sorry to dip into mineral.
Unfortunately, we don't have too much concern about TB in Canada.
You're incredibly lucky.
It's pretty well eliminated. We get a lot of cases cropping up. Most recently would be more in Western Canada. They eliminated it from the cattle herd in the 60s and 70s, and they've been able to stay on top of it.
Yeah, our problem is our reservoir, particularly within wildlife population.
Got a question online there, Chance, if you wanna ask the question?
Hey, sorry, I don't mean to butt in, but I just had a quick question, if you don't mind. You mentioned kind of early on in the presentation that you have two herds, the herd that's indoors and then you had a second herd that's outdoors. I was just wondering if you could maybe go into depth, kind of in the same way you did with the indoor herd, maybe obviously not to the same extent, but just on what the outdoor herd's diet is like.
So our outdoor herd will take them to 500 pounds. So our outdoor system is not a traditional UK outdoor system. It's really the New Zealanders have really perfected it, which is kind of where, and where it all came about is I was presenting our indoor system one day and a New Zealand academic challenged me and really tore into me for about 40 minutes on everything that was wrong with the way we were doing it. And to be fair, his numbers did add up. That's where that one came from. If you wanted to do any wider reading on it. And the basic principle is we want to have animals that are growing at a reasonable growth rate outside all of the time. There's another element there as well. So whenever you take with us an animal from an indoor diet to an outdoor diet, so say we went from a traditional grass silage inside to grass, perennial ryegrass outside, it takes the rumen roughly about 4 weeks to swap over. And we have recorded losses in growth rate of 60 kilograms off a 500 kilogram. That's a lot of pound conversion. So that'd be what, 100 pounds off a 1,100 pound animal just in those 4 weeks. So you've got this thing where you swap over from an indoor diet to an outdoor diet. You get, as the rumen changes over, you get a loss in condition of the animal, and then it has to try and recover again. So the principle of the all outdoor system is you miss out these points where you're swapping from indoors to outdoors and outdoors to indoors, and you want to try and maintain your relatively high growth rate throughout the variety of the time. Now we can do that in the summer through rotational grazing. So rotational grazing on perennial ryegrass for us, in a good year will give you 1.5 pounds a day. In a bad year, will give you about half that. So what we try to do is to mitigate the bad years, is that on forage quality, we might give them a tiny little bit of something else. So it might be a little bit of barley, a little bit of, I mean, we've even given them a little bit of forage maize out of a clump this year, just to maintain that sort of 1.5 pounds a day. Now, if we maintain that 1.5 pounds a day, we still finish at 15 or 16 months of age. So if you think about it, we're still maintaining a relatively high level of overall performance. So that's what we do in the summertime. In the winter time, we then swap over to a variety of options. This year, we are grazing kale. Do you have kale here?
Yeah.
You have kale.
It's not commonly grown, but it is certainly.
New Zealand used to grow a lot of kale. They stopped growing kale because there's quite a few anti-nutritional factors in there. They found fodder beet to be better. So we grow kale and have grown a lot of kale. Growth rates on kale, we typically get actually higher than 1.5 pounds a day. We probably get more like 2 a lot of the time. So quite simply, around about November, we gradually start swapping them over onto the kale, and then we'll graze the kale by an electric fence. So they'll get a 50% allocation of kale every day, and then they'll get a 50% allocation of round-baled silage every day. And again, that's formulated to try and give you your 1.5 pounds a day. So we can give them more kale if we want to, we can give them more silage if we want to. We can also mix diets up and take it out to them if we want. There's a range of ways of doing that. So that's our first option. Next year, we will be using what the New Zealand system currently is, which is fodder beet. Wonderful thing about fodder beet is that it is massively high in energy. Massively high in energy. So the bulb, now, in our system, they have to pull the bulb up. So you can see where you guys might run into problems with frozen grounds.
They'll chew down into the ground.
They actually chew down into
Sheep,
sheep will.
they'll eat into the ground to get the rest of the.
So we have the bulb now. The bulb is your source of energy. It's massively high in energy. We're talking TDM. Probably 80, 85%, maybe even higher. Very, very, very rich energy source. The plant material at the top of the fodder beet is your protein source. So fodder beet gets more complicated because you have to graze enough green material in front to be the protein, enough of the bulb to be the energy, and then you need round baled silage as your fibre. So we will be using fodder beet. New Zealanders have moved over onto fodder beet because they get better performance than they do out of kale. So we will be trying that. The other option is obviously bale grazing, or we could even take some of the diets that we have out there out, provided ground conditions allow for that, and just feed them there. And quite simply, we will calve a block of dairy cows in the autumn. We will then feed one of those growing diets behind us to get them to about 500 pounds, which is roughly about the point in time you'd wean a suckler calf. The idea is we want, if the rumen is really, the rumen gives out roughly the same heat as an electric 12 kilowatt electric fire. That's why ruminants are so good in the snow. They have got a heating source there. That's why in Ireland we lived above them. Do you guys do that here? Maybe your history isn't long enough to go back that far.
No, probably.
There was a time, I think there was a couple, yeah.
There are some old.
So some old sites like that. So
There's nothing like that today, but I mean.
So if you go and look at you go and look at my workshop, which used to be one of those, you had the cows down below, and then you had the living accommodation top, your heat went through the floor. But that doesn't really start working fully up until about 500 pounds. So we calve them in the autumn. They spend the winter inside with us, where we rear them as we would normally to hit that 500 pounds for maximum grass growth in April, which should be the ideal weather conditions. Probably, I have put them out in snow before. Ideally, it should be the ideal weather conditions. And that is that robust animal that is then able to look after itself until the end. And we quite simply go around the rotational grazing system, which will give us similar yields to I've got up there. We'll be trying to graze a similar quality of grass that you will see there going into our forage, which becomes quite complex with grass growth, rain forecast, all that there sort of stuff. If you think about working on a paddock basis. There is now a move towards regenerative grazing in the UK, which is actually grazing swords that are height of me. And those guys are reporting very high growth rates as well. So there's a whole variety of ways of doing it. But anyway, you go through your rotational grazing system, and then you move straight on to your outdoor winter crop, which removes the 4 weeks of changeover, and you quite simply keep rotating around. We had animals, our average live weight at 12 months old was, and that was going into kale, so first winter inside, through the rotational grazing stage, they're now 2 months into kale. I think the average live weight is 450 kilograms, so 900 pounds-ish. Live weight at about 14 months of age. So we will be getting up towards our slaughter weights. Certainly by the time we finish kale, the question I have in my head is, do we keep going for another rotational grazing cycle? Because they don't lay down too much fat. We will do that only with our Aberdeen Angus's. We do it with our British Shorthorns because they're adapted. They will lay down enough fat on that diet. If we were to do it with our British Blues, those would probably have to come inside.
So these still have half dairy, half British Blue, or half Angus?
Yeah, everything we do has half dairy.
Half dairy.
Everything we do is half dairy, yeah. Now, the changes in that system is we do have cow-calf producers in the UK that do the same system. And the advantage the calf has is that it has mummy to look after it. So they will have exactly the same principles, only you have a cow-calf pair or a suckler cow, and the calf will stay with its mother for an extended period of time, most likely 9 months. And they'll quite simply swap off at about 9 months of age, swap off, wean, and then just continue on. Some of them will even autumn calve. So at this time of the year, if you go to some of those farming systems, you'll see the cow maybe grazing keel or fodder beet, and then a little creep gate. And then you'll have the calf with its grass diet and whatever it wants that's probably better. Do you get where I'm coming from for a calf at that time of the year? And those guys, they won't house them at all. Now, in terms of the economics, our systems are essentially, at Harper, our two systems is probably the only place in the UK where the two systems are all on the same site, two extremes. You have the absolute intensive beef production, dairy beef production, and the absolute extensive outdoors. I've done some modelling work in the last 8 weeks, and I reckon for our outdoor system to completely compete with our indoor system on everything, so that would include costs of production, and I don't mean just feed, I mean the price of the shed, the price of the concrete, the price of the tractors, everything. I reckon our outdoor system would still have to do about £1.5 a day to break even with the other one. Now, the obvious difference between the two is that, say, I don't know, me and my sister fell out. I got sacked from Harper and I wanted to go tenant farming in the UK. Obviously, the start-up value of the outdoor system, a hell of a lot easier than the start-up value of the indoor system. And the expansion of the outdoor system is a lot easier than the expansion of the indoor system. So yeah, it's pretty much, now you need a soil type and climatic conditions that suit for the outdoor system.
So have you looked at grazing corn in your outdoor system?
I would love to.
Because I think, like, from our perspective, corn, I think, would work better than kale or beet, because even the kale is gonna basically disintegrate once it gets past into January, like mid-January with the cold.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't be any beet top left at all worth talking about once you got into January and February. In fact, at college years ago, they grazed, for a couple winters, they grazed like stubble turnips that they went through before it got really cold and grazed the top off. And then they went back and grazed the roots or the tuber. And that's why I know that sheep will actually hollow them down into the ground, because it's kind of fun. You think they just eat them off the surface, and that's what they did, but then they go back later and they'd actually hollow them.
It's not rock solid.
I don't know how they did it, but they did it. I'm sure it
No
was hard.
teeth left.
I'm sure it was hard on the feet.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to graze corn silage. I don't know if it's possible under our climate. I don't know what it keeps like.
So the guys that have grazed here, you know, the plant dries down and the leaf stays on it. And it's actually fun to watch the cows, because the cow just, they walk right up to it, open their mouth, and they basically just inhale the cob. And then they go back and they clean up what's left, and they probably leave about what you leave if you were chopping the plant. But it's fun to watch them, like with the cob, because they just, they just swallow the cob into their mouth and then grind it up.
I mean, corn silage is, you know, corn is massively bent. It's just so consistent. That
And
consistent.
Certainly, there's one guy that we worked with, he grazed 1 year. He had enough corn that he was able to graze his cow herd with calves and foot into April. So I mean, once you get into April, you're almost into the new grass season. So, and he just ran it out. It wasn't that he stopped doing it, he just ran out of corn.
So yeah, I think that pretty much summarizes.
So in those diets, you talk about using a little bit of barley. And certainly in Canada, there's a preference of eating barley over wheat. and a lot of concerns or paranoia about feeding wheat. My personal feeling is that in ruminant diets, unless we follow a Western grain-fed diet for finishing, we're not getting to levels that we run into problems with wheat in terms of acidosis. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah. I have never caused acidosis with a barley-based diet. And I've had technicians who have tried. Normally on the weekend. Was that, you know, and you're just walking past, was that bin totally empty? Oh, yeah. Did you just throw it all in? Oh, yeah. It's now full. Are they gorging themselves on it? Yeah. Oh. I've never caused acidosis with a barley-based diet. I have caused acidosis in a similar scenario with a wheat-based diet, but it was very high in wheat.
But if you're putting in the percentages that you're talking about, the
Oh,
barley,
no.
you can,
No,
there's no concern about using wheat.
no.
And that's been my kind of contention. And I see like dairy, we got lots of dairy producers grow all kinds of winter wheat, sell the winter wheat, and go back and buy barley and probably pay more for the barley than what they got paid for the winter wheat.
For the dairy cow, the wheat would arguably, so I'll counter that with, the reason we're feeding so much barley is because our nutritionist on the dairy side, I take nothing to do with the dairy cow nutrition, it's a commercial nutritionist, has said that we should be feeding barley to dairy cows and they should only feed wheat. So the reason I'm feeding barley is because we're going to sell it. So there's a, there's the counter. At those sorts of levels, you're not gonna, you wouldn't have any risk of acidosis. And in fact, we've hit a forage shortage at the minute, so I've just lowered our forage down to 25% on a dry matter basis. So it's mostly concentrate. And it'll be like that for a couple of months until we harvest again. And I still wouldn't worry. It's only maybe when you get down to 10 to 15% forage in a diet on a dry matter basis. And with something like wheat that I would start to worry about acidosis.
Yeah.
But even then, if they're adapted to it, you know, I've run experiments, acidosis experiments with dairy cows, where some of my acidosis work. It would surprise you how hard it is to give acidosis to a dairy cow. So we would put a rumen pH in them. And quite frankly, so the way of doing it is a formulated diet that I think is going to cause acidosis, and we go down in 2 days and download it. So you do that, and put in an astronomical quantity of wheat, and go down in 2 days, and it hasn't budged. And you go again with more. So yeah, but what I would say is there's a big difference in diet provision. So if you feed a dairy cow on TMR, very difficult to change rumen pH. If you're feeding in a parlour, concentrate in one short, sharp snap, rumen pH just drops through the floor. So yeah, there's a difference in provision as well. The advantage of the beef animal is that they're probably taking it in a little bit at a time, in a mediated amount. But yeah, we wouldn't worry about feeding wheat, on the fact that for us it's expensive.
Any more questions online?
No, I don't see any.
If there's no more questions, we're probably done for this evening, so. I know we didn't get there in person, but glad everybody that got on, and I hope we didn't miss anybody by not coming in person. I hear you guys are having a shitty day, so it's, when we look at our weather here, it's hard to believe that the difference, but anyway. Thanks for getting on, so. See you the next time.
Thank you.